How we doing, folks? Mr. V here again to talk to you a little bit about the review material over the Constitution. The review today is going to talk about the articles within the Constitution, kind of walk you through some of the constitutional seek and find that you did this week, as well as set the stage for talking about some constitutional principles as well. Now, the breakdown of the Constitution starts off, and the very first question on your seek and find was, what are the 6 things that the Constitution guarantees? Now remember, the Constitution is different than the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence was written in 1776 during the American Revolution by Thomas Jefferson and a pool of other people, including Ben Franklin and John Adams. They were trying to not only separate from Great Britain officially, but also talk about some of the Enlightenment philosophies that they held dear about not only government, but also the rights, and in this case, natural rights of all humans. So remember, the Declaration of Independence was talking about how all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator by certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So all of those very vague things were guaranteed of all citizens. So what are they doing 11 years later in 1787? They're realizing that the Articles of Confederation did not work. They're realizing that the Articles of Confederation were not a solid system of governance and would not hold up over time. So instead of that, they were putting in place the Constitution. And in 1787, a large group of individuals got together in Philadelphia, again in the Constitutional Convention. They were different than those that wrote the Declaration of Independence in some cases. You know, George Washington during the Declaration of Independence was not serving in the Second Continental Congress. He was out in the field fighting the American Revolution, leading the troops. But he was the president of the Constitutional Convention. There were new faces like James Madison, who was young and would have been much too young to be involved in the Second Continental Congress during the American Revolution, but was very involved in the formation of the Constitution, as was Alexander Hamilton and a whole host of other new individuals. The people that wrote the Declaration, people like Jefferson and Adams, they weren't even in the country. They were serving as diplomats over in Europe, in England and France. Okay, and then Ben Franklin, who was kind of the old sage, if you will, but who had served on both the Declaration Committee and also in the Constitutional Convention. He's one of the holdovers between the two, but he was not as involved this time around as he was the first one. So what you're talking about is kind of a new generation of leaders coming along and formulating a republic that they think is going to hold true to the Declaration, the founding principles, I guess, of the Declaration of Independence. They're trying to do in the Constitution just 11 years later. Now, they start off saying, we the people. They're talking about how the government's not going to reign supreme, the people are. Okay, that this is your guarantee as an American. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, so they wanted a union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. Those are the 6 things right there. Okay, that union, justice, tranquility, which means peace, by the way, defense, promote the general welfare, which is the well-being. They're not talking about the welfare state. They're certainly not talking about food stamps and things like that. That comes way later in the American Republic. So welfare, in this case, we're talking about the general well-being of the United States, and secure the blessings of liberty. Okay, those are the things. Now, these are very vague, and these are being promised to all citizens, if you will, through the Constitution. But again, anytime something is vague, it can be argued. And because of that, this is kind of the stance of, the Constitution. Is it supposed to be as written, that this is what you're guaranteed and nothing more? Or is it a living document? You're going to hear this argument throughout American government, and then you're going to hear it certainly as you go out into the world and kind of make your way. You're going to hear this argument over the Constitution. Was it the way the founders intended and the way they wrote it to the letter of the law, which is considered to be judicial restraint or conservative policies on the Constitution, going back to our political spectrum talk from last week? So is it going to be conservative in their approach, talking about this is the way that the founders intended, or is this going to be a living document that through the course of American history adapts to the people and the time frame? These are basic arguments over the Constitution that you still hear on the Supreme Court, you hear in general American discourse, and you certainly hear during election time. Okay, so it all comes back to how you see the Constitution. All right. Now the Constitution then breaks off into 7 individual articles. Okay, there are 7 articles in the United States Constitution. And they start with the one the framers thought was the most important, certainly the one they were nervous about the most, the legislative branch. They thought that this one had power, and it makes sense because they're coming from a British system where they thought the Parliament should have more say and the king should have less say. Remember, they were rebelling against that system of government, saying that the Parliament should have done more for us and that the king was outside the boundaries of his authority. So this is a very Enlightenment way of doing things, is if we're going to set up where we think Congress is going to be the most important and the most influential, then we better rein it in. So not surprising, the sections from the article go through in great detail how this Congress will be set up. So they talk about the powers vested in the national legislature. They start right off with what the powers are. They then move into how the House is set up and the terms of service, 2-year terms, 435 members as it stands today, and based upon population. Meanwhile, the Senate, 2 per state, equality, the equality between the states, which means since we have 50 states, we have 100 senators in the Senate. They serve 6-year terms. So that was part of the whole Connecticut or Great Compromise debate that Roger Sherman managed to kind of push through when they were having debates over representation in Congress between big and small population states. We still have those arguments even up to this day. Then, of course, you have the election and the first day being established. Now, this was altered by the 20th Amendment. When we talk about the amendments, we'll certainly talk about that. And that was basically what is known as the lame duck amendment, this idea that when we vote in November, so we're going to vote on November 3rd for the next president of the United States, all members of Congress are running for their election as well. All members, I should say, of the House of Representatives are running, and 1/3 of the Senate will be on the ballot as well. So to put some local spin on that, that means your House member is Steve Chabot. He will be up for re-election again on November 3rd. He's been your congressman ever since you were a little tyke. And quite honestly, even before that, okay, he's only, not been your representative for 2 years of your life in the early 2000s when he lost re-election way back in the early 2000s. But Chabot has been your representative for the most part all your life. And then, of course, in the Senate, you have 2 senators from the state, and this is what makes Ohio a swing state, okay, as we talked about in the political spectrum. Sherrod Brown, who is a Democrat, and Rob Portman, who's a Republican, are both your senators. So your state elected 1 from each party. Most of the time, that doesn't happen. Most of the time, if your state's conservative, you're voting into Republicans, or if your state is liberal, you're voting into Democrats. You are a swing state because you have a senator from both sides of the political aisle, okay? Again, that doesn't happen all that often, but we choose to do it that way in Ohio. So they are not on the ballot this time around. You already re-elected them in previous election cycles. Like I said, every 2 years, there is an election going on, and in the Senate, 1/3 of the Senate is up every 2 years, okay? Meeting rules and journal are also discussed, and that's a big thing. They have a congressional record where they have to write down everything that occurs, every speech, every motion, every vote has to be recorded. Salary and benefits are discussed in the Article 1. How a bill becomes a law, the process that it has to take, and we'll certainly talk about that this year. Powers of Congress are expressed, 17 are expressed very specifically, so the power to tax, the power to regulate commerce, which is trade, the power to declare war, those are all legislative powers. The president cannot declare war. The old joke in D.C. is that he can start a war, but he can't declare one, he can't make it official. Only Congress can do that. And if you remember, the last time we actually officially declared war was during World War II. We never declared war on Korea, we never declared war on Vietnam. Those were conflicts because Congress never declared war on those governments, okay? The last official declaration of war was World War II right after Pearl Harbor, okay? The limits on congressional power are also talked about here, as well as limits on state legislatures. Now, of course, Article 2, much shorter, because they spend so much time on the legislative branch The executive branch was they weren't sure what it needed to look like. There were some that thought it should be very, very low key and should not be very powerful because they were concerned about King George III. Others were, a little more pushy about having a fairly strong executive. They kind of met in the middle, but quite honestly what they did is they said, George Washington's probably going to be the first president. Let's trust him to do the right thing. They had trusted him before. He had proven time and time again that he was pretty trustworthy with power, and so because of that, George Washington was kind of left to his own devices to define what it was to have an executive office. And so he did somewhat describe or at least help define the office of the president. He was the precedent president. Precedent meaning the first time something is done and everybody follows. One of the main precedents he sets is 2-term limits. That he basically served 2 terms and then decided to retire. Everybody from that point on all the way up to FDR followed that precedent. Only one president ever went more than 2 terms, and that was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. After he died in office, people said, you know what, that's too much power for one man. And certainly some people also said, hey, that also killed FDR. It's certainly, because a lot of Americans think FDR was in his late 80s when he died. He was in his early 60s, and he died because of the stress of the office, amongst a whole host of other medical problems that he had as well. But it certainly drove him to an early grave with all the stress of both the Great Depression and World War II. So because of that, they started to say there should be a limit on that, and a constitutional amendment, I should say, later made it official that only 2 terms are allowed. So Obama was term limited, and if Trump wins on November 3rd and serves out that next term, he would also be term limited. And you'll hear from time to time some of his followers like to say, oh, well, Trump, he should run for a 3rd term. That can't happen. The Constitution's pretty clear on that with the amendment. He cannot run for a 3rd term, okay? They would have to change the Constitution in order to get that, to allow for that, okay? Because trust me, in my lifetime, if any president was going to figure out how to run for a 3rd term, it would have been Bill Clinton, okay? But he was term limited as well. So again, the term limits are set, okay? But it was just an understanding prior to that amendment. George Washington sets the tone, okay? They also talk about how the Electoral College works, how salaries and benefits work, what the oath of office is. Talks about the roles and the powers of the president, the State of the Union, which is the yearly address that the president has to make to give the State of the Union how the United States is doing. It used to be a letter from Jefferson all the way up through Woodrow Wilson. It was a letter. Then Woodrow Wilson decided he was actually going to go to Congress and give a speech, and it's been that precedent ever since. And that's why Donald Trump has to go in and talk to Congress every now and then, just to give a rundown of how the nation looks, okay? And we'll see what the election holds true, because if the election, puts Trump back into office for another 4 years, then he would give that speech. If it doesn't, then Joe Biden would now have that responsibility to give the rundown as well. But that is constitutional that they have to do that. At least once a year. And then impeachment and removal power, if you paid attention to the news last year, you know that Trump was part of that for the 3rd time in American history, we did have a president impeached. Now, to make sure we understand from the word go here, impeachment does not mean removed from office. It means that he was formally brought up on charges, okay? That does not mean he's guilty, doesn't mean he's removed from office. We've had that happen 3 times. Andrew Johnson during the Reconstruction after the Civil War. He was the guy that took over after Lincoln's assassination. He was impeached. Bill Clinton was impeached in the late 1990s, and of course Trump last year was impeached as well. Now, in all 3 of those instances, the Senate decided that they did not do enough to warrant being removed from office, and so they were not convicted of what they were charged with. So all 3 stayed in office. The only president who would have ever probably been impeached and convicted resigned from office before he ever got to that point. Richard Nixon, if you remember from your American history class last year, Richard Nixon and the Watergate scandal, when Richard Nixon violated a ton of federal law, election law, during the Watergate scandal, it became very clear that not only was he going to be impeached, but he was going to get convicted. That's when Nixon decided, all right, before all that happens, I'm going to walk away. To this day, he's the only president out of the 45 presidents we've had to resign from office. No other president resigned from office, okay? So impeachment and removal power are discussed also in Article 2. Article 3 is by far out of the first three the shortest because they didn't know what to do really with the judicial branch. But it does set up the judicial branch, which is the court system. It gives the supremacy of the Supreme Court. This is an older picture of the Supreme Court up here, okay? But again, it kind of gives you an idea what the Supreme Court kind of looks like normally. This picture, of course, has changed as Stevens has retired, Kennedy died, Scalia has died. So the names and faces on this have changed, okay? And it's certainly been very controversial at times as well. We'll kind of talk about that as we go through. But the Supreme Court reigns supreme, so to speak, in the judicial branch. Jurisdiction of the court, which is where they hold sway, where they hold power. The role in treason cases, which is the only crime actually discussed in the Constitution. Treason is it. They don't talk about murder, they don't talk about rape, they don't talk about fraud, none of that stuff. They talk about treason only. It's the only one named in the Constitution. And then finally, it's kind of assumed that when they sign off on the Constitution that they will kind of fill in the gaps later. And the Judiciary Act of 1789, which is right after the ratification of the Constitution, they pretty much fill in the gaps at that point, and anything left to fill in was filled in by a guy named John Marshall, who we'll talk about when we talk about the judiciary in Article 3 during that unit over the Supreme Court. Article 4 is the federal system that breaks down into national, state, and local levels. So again, it's kind of a separation of power, so to speak. We'll get to that here in a bit. It talks about the full faith clause, where for example, your driver's license is utilized in all 50 states. So as long as you pass the driver's exam in Ohio, you're good to drive in every other state. They cannot just pull you over and say, sorry, you can't drive here because, Connecticut has different laws over driving than in Ohio. Now, they can still hold you liable for violating their local laws, okay? So if they have a state mandate or a local mandate that says no turn on red and they don't have a sign up, it's just, that's the law of the state, and they say no turn on red lights, and you turn right, the police officers can still cite you for that because you have to be aware of local law. But again, they can't say, well, you can't drive here because you didn't pass the New Jersey state driver's exam. That's irrelevant. They have reciprocity, as it's known. That's why, I'm married in the state of Ohio, but if I move to Florida, I don't have to get remarried to my wife. They value and honor my marriage license. Okay, so again, full faith clause, we'll talk about that a little bit more when we hit federalism, and certainly when we talk about some Supreme Court cases, because this is challenged all the time. It talks about rights of citizens in individual states, how territories are formed, and the requirements of territorial government, which is important if you live in places like Puerto Rico, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, any place that is still considered a territory of the United States. Article 5 is the amendment process, so if you want to change the Constitution, this is the process you have to go through. Both houses of Congress have to vote on it, get a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate, and then you have to pass it off to the states. And through state votes or state conventions, as it's known, 3/4 of them have to come back in the affirmative for an amendment to be added to the Constitution. This has only happened 27 times, and 10 of them were right off the bat in 1791. Those 10 were, of course, called the Bill of Rights. The other 17 were over the next 220 plus years of the Republic. So we really have only averaged one change every 15 years or so, and usually they happen in spurts, like after the Civil War, during the Progressive Movement. It's very small little spurts here and there where they kick out an amendment. The last amendment to the United States Constitution that actually was added was the 27th, obviously, and that happened in 1992, so it's been a while. We're due for a amendment to the United States Constitution. But this is the process it has to go through in order to become one of those 27 amendments, okay, or the 28th, as it were, okay? Article 6 is the Supremacy Clause, which most people gloss over, but this is important to understand. This is making it very clear that if the national government says that this is the way they're going to do it, then that's the way it's going to be done. That, if Donald Trump says through an executive order, this is how this is going to be implemented, this is the change that I want, then they have to follow it, okay? The states have to follow it, the local governments have to follow it because the national government said so. If Congress passes a law and the state doesn't like it, too bad, that's the law, you have to follow it because, again, the national government reigns supreme. The one that most people have a problem with in modern day America is the Supreme Court. That when the Supreme Court comes in and overrules something, that then becomes the law of the land. And that's where you get some people who say things like, well, that's judicial activism, or that's legislating from the bench. These are terms you'll hear every now and then that are critical of the Supreme Court for what many people think is overreach, okay? But bottom line, it's the supreme law of the land. So for example, back in 2004 in the state of Ohio, we added to our state constitution that marriage was between a man and a woman. That was actually written into the Ohio state constitution, that marriage was not allowed between gay people, that it was just going to be for a heterosexual couple only. And from 2004 to 2015, that's the way it was handled in the state of Ohio, regardless of what any other state said or the national government. In 2015, in a Supreme Court case called Oberfeld v. Hodges, in that Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 majority, struck down a number of these laws that were out there from different states, and one of them being Ohio's, that said that gays could not get married. And when they struck that down, that it didn't matter what your state said at that point about gay marriage, it was allowed throughout all 50 states. Okay, so again, the Supremacy Clause can be very, very important to understand when there is a major shift in policy because of a Supreme Court case or a law passed by Congress. Okay. Finally, Article 7, the ratification process. Ratification means this is how they certify the document. So the Constitutional Convention went through, formulated the document, and then the last article was, all right, well, now that we've done this, how do we get the states to certify it? They said in the Constitution that only 9 states had to be affirm the Constitution for it to become law, but in reality they knew all 13 at the time. There were only 13 states. They knew all 13 probably needed to certify it. So there was a big push for ratification, and even though a couple of states initially said no, eventually they came around and said yes. And if you remember from your 8th grade U.S. history class, there was one state that didn't even show up to the convention. Okay, and that state was Rhode Island. They basically smelled a rat. They said, you know what, we don't want a change to the government, because they were a smaller state and they were worried that states like Virginia and Massachusetts that were more populous were going to take over. So they were a little wary of this, this convention, as it were. Be that as it may, the convention kicked out the document and eventually all 13 said yes. Okay, and one of the steps to being a state is the state has to also say, yes, we agree with the Constitution as well. So when Ohio became a state, we had to certify that the Constitution was indeed law. This comes up every now and then as well. The most major was when the South seceded from the Union. In order to be readmitted and put people back into the houses of Congress, they had to say that not only were they following the Constitution from this point on, they were also going to be following the new amendments, of which they were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, depending upon when those states came back in, which were the Civil War amendments, which granted rights and freedoms to former slaves. Okay, we'll talk about that, of course, when we talk about the amendments. Be that as it may, the ratification, as soon as they ratify the document and certify the Constitution as the law of the land, and it is known as the supreme law of the land, as soon as that happens, the Constitution becomes relevant. Now, of course, some of the constitutional principles that are in the document are part of an assignment that we have this week. Not only are you going to be talking about the Federalist and Anti-Federalist argument over whether or not the powers of the Constitution went too far, and whether or not some of the constitutional principles and structures were a little bit too powerful, or not powerful enough in some cases. The arguments between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists give us a good understanding of where the mindset was of the founders when they founded the Republic under the Constitution. But some of the principles that they put in, I'm going to focus on here, are 6 of them. The first one is limited government. The idea that the government may sometimes go too far. How do we rein them in? How do the American people, because remember the document starts off, we the people. So how do we the people make sure the government doesn't step too far? Doesn't infringe on our rights. Now we can, of course, look towards many of our amendments. The idea that we have a freedom of expression, that we have a freedom of religion, that we have a right to bear arms, due process under the law. Any of the amendments certainly could be utilized to talk about limitation of government power. But again, there are other ways as well that we limit the amount of influence the government may have on our day-to-day lives. And sometimes that goes into voting. Sometimes it goes into our rights to sue. All of that is involved in the Constitution as ways to limit the government's control over the citizenry. Okay? Judicial review is a style of checks and balances, so both of those kind of go hand in hand. Judicial review is the idea that any law passed by Congress, any executive action taken by the president, any state law, local ordinance, whatever else, can be subject to review by the judicial branch. That the Supreme Court or the Supreme Court of Ohio or local courts can review laws to decide whether or not they think the law is legit, whether or not they think it's constitutional. Okay? That is certainly a check on the power of the government, but there are other checks as well. So another principle there is the idea of checks and balances. So if the legislative branch, which their job is to make the law, and this is separation of powers, which is the fourth one on here, separation of powers, that you have this group that makes the law, this group that enforces the law, the executive enforces, and judicial interprets, so they tell you what it means. They all have a distinct job to do under separation of powers. They have separated, and they basically then institute checks and balances as a way of saying, why don't you stay in your lane? Okay, there are certain things you do, and what you've done has gone too far. So let's say the legislative branch makes a law. The president has to sign that law into existence, and Trump looks at it and says, I don't like this law, I think it goes too far. He has the right, as president, to veto it. Okay, that is his check on legislative authority. Well, the legislature also has a check on his authority. So let's say he vetoes it, it goes back to the legislative branch, they re-vote on it, and they override the veto. Okay, they decide that, nope, we don't need the president to sign off on this. We're going to do it anyway because we think it's a good law. That law becoming, or that bill becoming a law at that point is in itself a check on presidential authority. Okay, and of course, like I said, the judicial branch has judicial review, which is a major check on that, because then they could look at the law and say, well, the president we feel is right in vetoing it. It's too far. It's too unconstitutional. All of that goes into those principles. Okay, federalism, as we talked about before, is the breakdown into national, state, and local. And this chart goes into how they divide the executive. So for example, the executive at the national level is the president, but at the state level is the governor, and at the local level is a mayor or trustees. All of that is broken down under the federal system in the Constitution. And finally, popular sovereignty, the power of the people within the country to make their own laws and own decisions about their government. Okay, your power reigns supreme. Again, popular sovereignty, always remember the Constitution starts off, we the people. Okay, that the people hold the power. All right, so I'm going to post this on your Google Classroom so that you have this as a reference. You can certainly look through it. I'm inviting you this week that as you're doing your assignments, of which I'm going to give you 2 assignments. One of them is to look at the Federalists and Anti-Federalists and their arguments over the Constitution, whether or not the Constitution goes too far or doesn't go far enough, or whatever the case may be. You're going to look at those arguments, okay, and you're going to fill out forms based around their arguments and understandings of the Constitution. And the other one is over these constitutional principles, okay? So if you have any questions over any of those or any of the stuff from last week over the Constitution and our other founding documents, please feel free to email, and then I will try and do a better job of staying on office hours. My office hours are going to be a little rough at times, but office hours for the most part are going to be noon till about 12:30, 12:45, depending upon the day. If you need special office hours, please email me and request them. I'll do the best I can to meet with you anytime that you need, because I realize some of you have some crazy work schedules, or you have a hard time getting onto the computer, on the internet, and getting onto a Zoom or a Google Meet during the school day. So please make sure you keep communicating with me about any issues or problems you're having within the course. Other than that, I hope you guys had a great weekend, and good luck this week on getting your work done for government.